Today is the day to complete and decorate the cake. Yesterday we leveled and filled the layers and crumb coated the cake. I'm starting with the big layer here, the 14-inch layer, which has been covered with a thin layer of sieved apricot preserves. The chilled buttercream stabilizes the cake so that you don't get crumbs, and the preserves help it stick. It's sort of like a very thin coat of glue, and once it's all on, I just take my finger and I wipe off the excess. I'm going to roll out the fondant. I've softened it slightly in the microwave so it's pliable. I have too much here. I have about 7 pounds, but I'd rather have too much than too little. And I'm going to roll it out to a circle of about 21 inches in diameter, which is the diameter across the top of the cake plus 2 of the sides. And that will be plenty. You want it to drape nicely. You expect to trim off excess, but you certainly don't want to be caught short. I'm using my largest wool pat mat, which allows me to roll it out with perhaps just a little bit of confectioner's sugar if it starts dragging, but you don't want to dry out the fondant. And when that's done, rolling it out with this very large pin, which is almost a lethal weapon, I'm going to use a smaller French pin to roll it up, and I'll transfer it and unroll it on the cake. And once it's on the cake, then it'll be smoothed and trimmed, and that will complete the covering of the largest fondant layer. Alright, well, this is the short person solution to regulation size countertops. In order to get my body into this, I'm up on a little step stool, rolling it out with my mega pin. I have stuck into my apron a hat pin, and if I see any little air bubbles, I puncture them and rub them out. This is now just about done. It's about 1/8 of an inch thick. You don't want to get it too thin, but on the other hand, found out being about $4 a pound and very, very sweet, you don't want it too thick either. It's a little bit of a thick edge over here, but I think this is about done. What I'm going to do before I put it on is polish it a little. There's a coating of powdered sugar that gets on it, and you'd really like a warm glow to it, even though I'm going to dust it with a sparkle dust later. You just want to get it as pretty as you can from the get-go. Okay, I'm going to measure it to make sure that it's my 21 inches, and it is that and more, so I'm not going to have a problem of it being too short. And the next step then is to roll it up and unroll it on the cake. Roll the fondant onto the cake, and what I'm going to do now is to smooth it down and take away excess, trim the bottom, and when that's all done, then we'll get it on our decorated cake board. The important thing when you're putting the fondant on is to get the shoulders of the cake covered nicely, where it goes from the top to the sides, since it tends to want to pull. Now for this particular cake, it doesn't matter that much because the bottom layer is going to have piping on it. The fondant now has been smoothed. I've just trimmed off the bottom. I have my own unique system of letting it overhang over the edge of the counter, and I slice off the overhang with this little razor knife, which I think was meant to be a clay tool, but works really well with fondant. A lot of the cake decorating and clay tools are interchangeable. And I'm going to give it a final smoothing. You might notice, I don't know if you can see it on the video, that I do have some cracking at the shoulders, which probably happened because I didn't knead the fondant long enough. The longer you knead it, the softer it gets, the more air bubbles you get. So it's sort of a toss-up. But the design that's going on this layer will completely cover the shoulders, so those will disappear. So I opted for lack of bubbles. This is just about bubble-free over beauty. The next layer, however, the shoulders will show, but it's a smaller layer. And what I'll do is I'll knead the fondant a little more, get it a little warmer, so it won't crack as it goes on. But this is a good cover. The 2 layers have now been covered with fondant, and on the bottom layer, which is now resting on the cake board, the real decorative cake board, you'll see that there are pieces of 1/4-inch dowel that have been inserted. Those both help level the upper layers because they're all the same length, and also support it, and that's what keeps it from sinking. What happens next is this layer, which has now been covered with fondant, is going to be put on top of the larger layer. I've already made a hole through the cake board because I'm going to put a larger dowel through both pieces that's going to stick up a bit so that the decorative styrofoam top will be able to fit neatly on that dowel and come off easily for saving. So the next step then is to put a little dab of royal icing on the lower layer, just to hold things in place. I'll center this on it, and then I'll measure it and then put a dowel through that will extend about 1 inch above so that the decorative styro can sit on top. And that's the next step. It's almost time for a coffee break. I wanted to get to past the danger point before I stop working. We've been at this now for a couple of hours. And here's what we have. The 2 lower layers have been covered, they've been supported, and they've been stacked. A dowel was put in between the 2 layers, sticking up a little bit so that the styrofoam dummies would have a place to sit and be held firmly. They'll be held on with a little dab of royal icing once we set it up. Right? I centered the hole on the underside of the styrofoam and we sat it on. This is still loose. The styrofoam dummy sits on this. And the next step, now that I know that I have it where I want it, will be to ice the actual decorative piece to this, and then when they dry, we're going to start decorating the whole thing, which means adding on the flowers and doing all of the decorative piping. So that at this point, the basic construction is complete. And the fun part, the part making it really beautiful, piping on all of the decorations and the borders between the layers, will be the next step. I've started doing the decoration. Before I mix up the royal icing, I want to make sure that I have my pattern in place. I drew a pattern, which is what I used on the styrofoam dummy, sized to fit the circumference of this cake. I made enough copies so it would go around, taped them together, and I'm using a hat pin to prick holes along the curvy part, the swaggy part, and that'll serve as a guide when I pipe the royal icing swags. The rest of it, the little curlicues, are filled in freehand, and those are not a problem. When I finish with this layer, I'll move on to the next one where I'll do the same pattern of little dot flower-like designs that's on the top of the top cake dummy. And I'll pipe a border between the 2 layers here and a border on the bottom layer, probably just a plain ball border since you don't want to get it too ornate. Then I let the royal icing dry, and once the royal icing has dried up, then it's time to put the flowers on. But there'll be several hours of drying time so that I'm doing it in stages. So this is the royal icing work stage. Well, we're almost done. What you have here is the cake with the piped on royal icing decoration, and I put the dummy on top. I decided to try to keep the dummy as loose as possible so when the caterer takes it apart, the caterer won't have to wreck the border. So what this is actually is loose. I put this underneath over that dowel that was sticking up in the middle, and put this on top of it, and when it hardens up a little more, I can remove it. And then tomorrow at the country club for the wedding, I'll put it back on, and then it can be removed for serving. The next step is to dust it. The dummy layers are sparkly. This is it's called pearl dust. There are various kinds of dusting powders that are used for this type of cake decorating. Some are used to get realistic effects for flowers, and others are sparkly and can be mixed with alcohol to make a sparkly paint, as I did on the bodice of the little bride up here. Or it can be dusted like this, and what it will do is leave a shimmer over the fondant. It's completely non-toxic, so there's no problem there. It just adds a little touch of elegance. I'm still waiting for the royal icing to dry thoroughly before I put on the orchids, since the bottom royal looks dry, but if you put your finger into it, it might crush. You may also notice that I have the cake on a Lazy Susan, which is also another tool that is used by serious cake decorators. When you're working with a cake and need continuity, you need something that moves. This is a homemade job, made with a ball-bearing little gadget that is made just for this purpose. And that's great for larger cakes. For smaller cakes, there are revolving pedestals that you can get, light-duty ones inexpensively, or heavy-duty ones that hold up better. And it makes it much easier than to try to move the cake by hand. So this is the next to the last step. In about an hour or so, when I'm satisfied that the royal is completely dry, I'll take out those flowers, the purple flowers, and the tentative plan is to cascade them down the cake with one on a layer, starting here, going diagonally, which will pick up the color from the top of the cake and lend a very nice touch. And anyway, that's what the bride wanted. So one more step, but at this point everything is getting closer to completion, and the cake will be disassembled at the dummy pot for transport, which will make it a lot easier than trying to manage this. It's really quite heavy. Each layer of icing has several pounds of icing on it, so that I've never weighed one of these things, but I couldn't carry it by myself. So we're almost there, and let me just finish up this dusting.